Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Baker Bots Energy Enforcement Insider. It's our monthly 30-minute program that provides quick hits on the latest trends and developments in investigations and enforcement matters impacting energy market participants. My name is Michael Loesch. With me today, as always, is Brendan Quigley from New York. And we're pleased today to be joined by a special guest, Jim Barkley from our Houston office. So welcome, Jim. And thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to be covering Winter Storm Uri and the regulatory response and related enforcement issues. And then we'll have a few updates on DOJ, SEC, and CFTC matters. So I'm going to jump in. This is not formally on the agenda, but I thought it would be of interest to point out that last week, one of the commissioners of the CFTC, Commissioner Christy Goldsmith Romero, made a keynote speech at an FIA conference, and it's conference season now. You're seeing a lot of speeches by all the commissioners, and those are good ways to keep up on sort of trends and issues that are likely to be raised by the commission in the coming months. But specifically, I encourage you to take a look at Commissioner Goldsmith Romero's remarks at the FIA conference last week. She talked about cybersecurity, but the important aspect that I thought for this group would be worth noting is that she stated her belief that the CFTC should begin to devote significant enforcement resources to the voluntary carbon markets and the pursuit of fraud and what she referred to as greenwashing in connection with those markets. So that's been a topic of discussion generally at the commission, but it's not been firmly on the radar as an enforcement division priority. So I thought that was of note. She goes into some detail about those markets and her views. So I encourage you to take a look at that speech on the CFTC's website and start thinking about that from your own compliance perspectives. So with that, we'll move to our guest speaker, Jim Barkley. Welcome, Jim. And Jim's going to walk us through some of the latest updates related to Winter Storm Uri. Take it away, Jim.
Great, thanks. I really want to do just four things fairly quickly. I want to talk about what actually happened in the storm because I think it's helpful understanding the mess that we're in right now in Texas. And the mess really has less to do with the grid and more to do with the politics of the grid. Then we'll talk about what happened in response to the storm, kind of a rundown of a number of things that happened, and then focus on those that really affect enforcement the most, and then look at the political factors that are affecting enforcement. And then we'll talk about some specific things that folks ought to be watching out for in terms of compliance with very specific regulations, and that we've seen trip some folks up recently. So let's start with what actually happened. The chart that you see up there, this was sort of the inside baseball chart for Winter Storm Uri. If you read good news accounts of the storm, you would have read that we were within about 4.5 minutes of losing the grid in Texas. That's that kind of dark red area down there at the bottom. And you can see it says more gen units would have tripped if below 59.4 for 9 minutes or more. What does all that mean, and what does this chart mean? So this is about a 40-second snapshot of the frequency on the ERCOT grid. And you want the grid to be at 60 hertz. And you can see it's this, when this chart starts, it's down around 59.9, gets back up to 60, and then some things start to happen. You can see some generation outages taking place, and they're pretty chunky generation outages. So 1,418, that's likely more than one unit, 248, 329. I mean, those are good. That's good size generation outages, and that caused the frequency to start falling. In response to that falling frequency, ERCOT started to order some load shed. So they started ordering that some consumers of electricity be taken off the grid in order to try to, again, get demand and supply back back in balance, which is what gets you back up to the 60 hertz. The problem was those load sheds were pretty chunky too. So you see that first one in red there. Oh, at the very beginning, there's 1,000 megawatts. Then you get over around 140, a little after 143, you see another 1,000. When we get down to the bottom, they started to come in, a 3,000 chunk, then a 2,000 chunk. There's another 3,500 chunk. And those load sheds, because they were chunky, they also created issues on the grid. So after that, I guess the second load shed, it's just after 143, which is about 1,000 megawatts, you'll see, again, 3 more generation outages, 606, 688, 511. Those were likely due, at least that 606 was likely due in part to the load shed. The frequency was moving so much that was then causing generating units to trip offline. So between 143 and 153, they really start to lose control of the frequency, and it dips down below the 59.4 line. And that's important for 2 reasons, one of which got a lot of publicity. So when there are significant frequency drops, it can really damage people's equipment and their facilities. So once frequency gets that low, both generators and frankly people consuming power as well may want to take their facilities offline to avoid electrical damage to the equipment. But because we're in a situation where we're trying to control frequency, ERCOT, the grid operator, doesn't want everybody pulling their generation off immediately. They want a chance to restore that generation. So once the generation gets below 59.4 hertz, the generators are required to essentially start a clock, and it's a 9-minute clock. And if ERCOT can't get the frequency back up over 59.4 hertz in that 9 minutes, then those generators are allowed to go ahead and trip off. And we usually do so automatically. That's usually an automatic function. So that's what's going on there, or sort of in the 4.5 minutes on either side of 153. It's that area that you see as red. ERCOT is trying to get that frequency back over 59.4 before that 9-minute clock runs out, and they lose even more generation. And in fact, they made it. They made it with about a little over 4.5 minutes to spare. And that's the number that you will see in most of the good reporting on the storm, that we were within about 4.5 minutes of losing the grid. That is not quite the whole story. If you look down at the very bottom of that blue line, you'll see it says minimum frequency 59.302 hertz. So we got down as low as 59.302 hertz. And what didn't get as much attention in the press is that if you drop below 59.3 hertz, the 9-minute clock goes away. People are allowed to trip off immediately at that point. And I got the opportunity to talk to one of the utility operators who was in the utility control room, where they have a big board and they're watching frequency in real time. He actually told me he saw that frequency get down as low as 59.301. In any event, it was really low, and we were really, really close to that 59.3, at which point a lot more units would have tripped out. And there's a pretty good chance that we would have lost the grid, which means you then have to reboot everything. That is a process that we have never tried. We don't ever want to try. it might be doable in weeks, but I've also heard estimates of months. It's just really hard. You have to start establishing little, you only have a certain number of units that can start without there already being power on the grid. So you've got to get those started, create little islands, start connecting the islands. And as you're doing that, inevitably, some of those will trip back off. So it's an iterative process. It's a long process. It's a good thing we didn't have to go through that. So what we did go through was about 4 days with a lot of people without power. It was really cold. There was a lot of loss of life and property. And so that generated a number of responses. The Texas legislature, which was in session, passed a number of laws. They changed the governance structure and how the electric market is overseen. Examples, the PUC went from 3 members to 5 commissioners. They also changed some of the requirements for who can serve on the board at ERCOT. They changed, they did a number of things to reduce the risk of future electric system disruptions. We'll talk about that. That mostly means weatherization, emergency operation plans, and those we'll talk about those in a minute. They also made a number of changes to address the cost of the storm. There were a number of sort of buckets of money that people owed, and they allowed some of that money to be securitized. So they allowed, for instance, the utilities, the transmission and distribution utility, they allowed the gas utilities got to securitize money they were owed. There were retail electric providers who made some really large payments because of some things that were going on. There was a securitization to recover some of those monies and get it in their hands. All of that was done to try to protect the immediate financial health of the various participants in the ERCOT market, and to spread those costs over anywhere between, I think, 15 and 30 years. There were a lot of those statutes then led to rulemakings at the Public Utility Commission and the Railroad Commission. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then there was a FERC investigation, which kind of had some harsh things to say about Texas and its grid, but hasn't really gone much further than that at this point. And then there's been a ton of litigation, which isn't really the subject of this call, but just know there's a giant multi-district litigation out there, which has a lot of the plaintiff suits in it, people suing over loss of life, loss of property as a result of power outages. There have been a lot of contractual lawsuits between buyers and sellers of power. There are lawsuits seeking to get ERCOT, to force ERCOT and the PUC to reprice the market. You may remember the PUC directed ERCOT to take the price all the way to the price cap, and they did. It stayed there for 4 days. There's some dispute as to whether the PUC ordered it to stay there that long or ERCOT did that on their own. Not the topic for today. There's a lot of litigation out there. What I really want to focus on, though, is behind all of that, there is a real political contest going on. And I'll try to explain why I think this is really relevant for enforcement. But just know that on the one hand, you have Governor Abbott and the 5 public utility commissioners who he has appointed. They have been pursuing a type of market reform called a performance credit mechanism. Generators, largely thermal generators, coal, gas, nuclear, who can guarantee that they will be available during times of scarcity, get credits for being available in those times of scarcity. And then we require those who buy electricity at wholesale and sell it to retail customers. Those retail electric providers are required to purchase credits, a number of credits based on their share of the market. The idea behind that is that it will, the thought is that will create a financial incentive for people to build the kind of generation that can be brought online at a moment's notice in a period of scarcity. There's a lot of There's a lot of discussion about whether it will really work, whether it's too complicated, how long it will take to implement. But the governor and the PUC have come out in favor of it. You'll see this is on the left, there's a January 10th letter from Governor Abbott. He was imploring the commission, which was going to meet on the 12th of January, that they should endorse and pursue the PCM mechanism. The very next day, on the 11th, the day before they met, there was a letter from the lieutenant governor. From Senator Schwertner, not the letter that's on your screen, but a letter from Senator Schwertner suggesting to the PUC that they should not take steps to adopt the PCM mechanism until the legislature, he did not believe that it complied with statutory requirements, and they should not act until the legislature had a chance to weigh in. On January 12th, the PUC met. They endorsed the PCM method. They included some language giving deference to the legislature and suggesting that, this is all subject to the legislature weighing in. And then on January, I believe it's 19th, you get this letter again from Senator Schwertner, in which he declares that the PCM they had adopted is a substantial departure from the legislative intent of SB 3, which is there were a bunch, but it's one of the two big sort of electric market reform bills from 2021. So the lieutenant governor who presides over the Senate, and Senator Schwertner, who controls the key committee that oversees the PUC, have come out against the performance credit mechanism. What does this have to do with enforcement? This is one of the battlefields on which the governor and the lieutenant governor are waging their war against each other. And it means that at any given moment, somebody can be looking for political reasons to make an example out of somebody. And my own view, it's just a personal view, is that the grid in Texas is not in especially bad shape. That a lot of the debate we need changes. We needed changes. We've made some. We probably need some more. It's not clear to me that we need an entire overhaul, but we may. But regardless, there is a lot of political pressure being brought to bear on this issue. And that is where I start to worry about enforcement. So let's talk about a few areas where you might see that. Specific changes that were made. First one is in the area of weatherization. The PUC has now passed a rule. They actually passed an initial version and have since updated it, laying out some weatherization requirements. Kind of came in phases. There was some weatherization that needed to get done by 2022. There's some additional stuff you have to do in 2023. What I really need to know is that there are two dates. Every year, you have to be weatherized for summer by June 1st. Every year, you have to be weatherized for winter by December 1st. You have to meet those various requirements that are laid out in the rule. This year, those standards get a little more stringent. That really goes that the way that happens is the standards are now tied to being able to meet the most, I think it's the 95th percentile, the most severe case that we would expect to see in the summer or in the winter. By the way, there are separate rules for generators and for transmission and distribution utilities, but they read largely the same. So what you see on this screen is largely the same for both those who are generating power and the transmission and distribution utilities that are moving that power around. Everybody's got to submit declarations of readiness. For the winter, it's got to be submitted between November 1 and December 1. For the summer, it's got to be submitted between May 1 and June 1st. So that deadline will be coming up before just too long. That declaration has to include a notarized attestation that is sworn to by the entity's highest ranking representative, official, or officer with binding authority. So they want the boss, whoever the boss is at a particular company, they want the boss to swear in writing that they're ready. That obviously creates some compliance risk if it turns out you weren't ready. ERCOT then submits a compliance report to the PUC. For winter, that's done December 20th. For summer, that's June 20th. So again, just to kind of take the upcoming sequence for summer, everybody will be required to meet the weatherization requirements by June 1st. Then between May 1 and June 1st, you've got to make the notarized attestation. And then on June 20th, 20 days later, ERCOT is going to make a report to the PUC about who's in compliance and who's not. So failing to make that filing, failing to make that attestation gets you on a list that's going to go to the PUC. And if you're trying to avoid enforcement and PUC attention, that's not good. So those are important dates. Second area where we saw new rules was in the area of emergency operation plans. My experience has been that most of our clients already had pretty good operation plans. Some of them have had to tweak them a bit, update them, but they're significant documents, but it hasn't been overly burdensome for most of our clients. Those have to be updated every year on March 15th. So anything that has changed, you've got to account for. So that is something to be very attentive to in the next month, because those are due 1 month from tomorrow. That update again has to include that affidavit from a top officer. And then the third thing that happened, was there was some statute passed requiring the designation of critical natural gas infrastructure. But one of the problems that we ran into in the storm was that power plants that needed natural gas weren't able to get the natural gas. That was sometimes because of problems on the pipelines. Sometimes it was problems going all the way back to the wellhead, with wellhead equipment freezing up. A lot of the gas in Texas comes from oil wells. As you may know, oil wells produce a lot more water than they produce oil, and you got to deal with that water. In a lot of cases, the water treatment facilities at oil wells froze up, which meant you weren't producing the oil, which meant you weren't getting the gas. Had a lot of problems getting gas to market. So the idea is, and some of that gas infrastructure also found itself without power. And in some cases, it was without power because the power had been cut in response to the rolling outage orders. So what this order seeks to avoid is that latter situation. They want all of the gas infrastructure that is deemed critical, that needs to have power, to be deemed critical, and for the utilities to have that information. A lot of folks who owned gas infrastructure that was critical just hadn't notified utilities that it was critical, and so the utilities didn't know. This seeks to rectify that. Those designations, again, have to be made each year, March 1 and September 1, so that's winter and summer, and there is penalty authority as well. Now, last thought, which is going to tie back to the political problem. The Public Utility Commission does not have the resources to go out and inspect every generating facility and every transmission and distribution line. They have done inspections. They say they have inspected everybody, and they have, I think, in some way, but the depth and quality of those inspections varies tremendously. What we advise our clients is you want to be somebody they are not interested in. With very limited resources, that's both financial resources and human resources, they're not going to be able to focus on that many folks for real serious investigation and potential enforcement. And they are naturally going to look to the most egregious and obvious problems. So that's where you don't want to be. I mean, ideally, you just want to be in compliance. but you certainly don't want to be in such non-compliance that it is obvious and egregious, because that will attract attention. And in a political environment where there is a desire to show that we're doing something, we're making things better, we're on top of it, we're punishing the bad actors, this is not the time to be poking your head up as somebody who hasn't filed the right report, hasn't filed it correctly. So these dates, while these reports may seem simple, they may seem pointless, they're important, and you need to be sure and hit those dates. And I will stop there and see if there are any questions. And if not, I'll turn it back over to our hosts.
Great. Jim, thank you. That was great. We're going to now turn to Brendan Quigley, who's going to give us some updates on DOJ matters. Brendan?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Not too much to report in kind of enforcement actions, energy-specific enforcement actions on the DOJ front over the last couple of months. And the big news out of DOJ was in January, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, Kenneth Polite, gave a speech at Georgetown Law School where he announced some additional changes to the DOJ Criminal Division corporate enforcement policy, aka the policy that DOJ uses to determine when a company should be criminally liable for the actions of its agents and employees, and their respondeat superior doctrine. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm not going to get too much into the detail here. But, bottom line is that DOJ continues, at least in the criminal division, which includes, the FCPA unit, the fraud section, not the U.S. Attorney's offices, but is, kind of persuasive authority for the U.S. Attorney's offices. They continue to kind of attempt to sweeten the pot for companies to self-disclose wrongdoing. And here, the big change was they said even when certain aggravating circumstances are present, and there's a list of some of the aggravating circumstances in the current policy up there on the kind of towards the middle of the screen. Prosecutors may still decline criminal charges against the company. So kind of what they call a declination with disgorgement, where the company isn't prosecuted but disgorges its ill-gotten gains if certain other circumstances are present, including extraordinary cooperation, voluntary self-disclosure, and then similarly, even if the criminal division determines that criminal resolution is still warranted, there will be benefits to the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines fine, that were more significant than had previously been in place. I think the big takeaway here is obviously these factors. To go back a slide, what is full cooperation versus, extraordinary cooperation? What is cooperation? There's a lot of play in the joints. DOJ wants, and they frankly need, in these big investigations, particularly big corporate investigations, they need cooperation because they're not, among other reasons, they're not staffed. They don't work like a law firm, and they can throw hundreds of contract attorneys or dozens of contract attorneys on a big document page, right? They're pretty limited, but they have a lot of power under the law in terms of personnel. They can't flex like a law firm or a legal department can. In reality, deciding whether to take advantage of these policies is extremely difficult in the moment, right? Because oftentimes you don't know what, it's great to say, oh, we'll voluntarily disclose criminal wrongdoing by one of our employees or agents, but you don't always know. You need some time to investigate. I think that's one thing we're hearing, and I think DOJ has kind of said off the record, look, we understand you need time to brief the board, things like that, but we expect before there's a Wall Street Journal story about it, you'll have voluntarily self-disclosed. I think this will continue to play out, even though this is a DOJ policy, right? It doesn't have the effect of law. This will continue to play out in the courts. Right now, there are a number of individual defendants in cases in both the Southern District of New York and the District of New Jersey that I'm aware of who have been charged after their company fully cooperated with the DOJ and got lenient treatment, and now they're bringing various motions saying that essentially the DOJ turned the company into a state actor. So again, just something to be aware of in terms of kind of where the DOJ's head is at on these things, and kind of how this will continue to play out, both in terms of policy and in terms of the courts. So I think with that, we're out of time. We included a final bullet point here about SEC examination priorities. The Division of Inspections came out with their annual exam priorities last month, or early February, more for investment advisors than issuers, but note the ESG focus, and we expect to see more SEC enforcement in that area. So I think that's it for today. Michael, any closing comments?
No, thanks to Jim Barkley, our guest, and thanks for everybody for joining us. We'll see you next month, and if you have any questions in the interim, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.